Hi, good morning, everyone. We're about to kick off our webinar on SAP role optimization. My name is Rogan Morrison. Let's give people a few more minutes to join, and then we will start the webinar. It's great to have everybody on board today. So just give us a minute or two while we just wait for everybody else who may be joining from other meetings or coming in a little bit late. Let's give them an opportunity to join us for this webinar today. I see lots more people joining in the meantime, and we'll kick off very shortly.
Rogan, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay, because I had some technical issues. Good morning.
Good morning, Andreas. Good to have you on board here. Right.
You're welcome.
Alrighty, I think we're pretty much ready to go in this webinar. We've got a number of people who've joined us, so welcome to all those who've joined us. My name is Rogan Morrison, and with me today presenting from VOQUZ and from CBIS is my colleague Andreas Naab. We're going to specifically look at SAP role optimization, just in terms of some housekeeping right at the start of this webinar. This webinar is recorded, and the presentation as well as the webinar recording are made available afterwards. So if you have colleagues or people who are not able to attend that you want to share this with, please have a look. You will receive a link to both the presentation and to the recording. We will also mention this is part one of our SAP GRC SAP series, especially looking at a specific focus on access authorizations and risk and compliance for your SAP solutions. And it's great to have so many people joining us this morning. So let's get into it. What is our agenda for this webinar today? We're going to just share some company information with you. For those of you who are not necessarily familiar with VOQUZ Labs, we're going to look at the current situation that many organizations find themselves in with regards to their roles. And I'll be having some discussions with Andreas about his experience in this space. We'll look at the drivers for role optimization and where companies are putting their efforts are in terms of the role optimization. We're going to run some polls during the course of this webinar, so we hopefully get some good feedback from you as an audience and can then share some information. We're going to look at the two approaches that we see that you can have towards role optimization. One, a wide-ranging approach and a fast approach, and then we'll have another poll and then jump into some questions. So great, let's kick it off from there. Just a bit about VOQUZ Labs as an organization. We really focus in a niche and specific way on SAP license management, authorizations, and compliance. We are part of the VOQUZ group, which was started in 1980, so have a long history, way back over 40 years now. And in 2010, we launched SAMQ. It came out of a large German utilities organization. We realized that we needed to find a better mechanism to manage license management across the SAP landscapes. And we launched this in a global way in 2015, opening offices in the US and further into Germany and the rest of the regions around Germany. In 2018, we joined up and we combined our SAMQ solution with SETQ, and SETQ specifically looks at authorization management and compliance. And we again expanded our regions into the Latin America space and also into Africa, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific and Japan. So from an overall perspective, we work in a number of different geographies. We work across a number of different countries and different industry sectors. And we have over 400 clients working with us, both in the license management space as well as in the authorizations and compliance side. And as I say, our real focus for most organizations is to find ways to optimize and to maximize the investment that they've made in SAP. For most organizations, this is a significant investment. And so you have to find ways to save costs as well as improve your efficiency on an ongoing basis. And so that's really our focus areas at a VOQUZ Labs detailed level. As I said, we have 2 specific solutions, and then we have some advisory capability as well, which helps organizations not only implement the solutions in the right way, but also maintain them and manage the relevant challenges that you have in this space, especially around authorizations and compliance. So in this webinar, we're going to specifically focus on the left-hand side of the items here in terms of the identity authorizations and management aspects, which really pertains to what SETQ does and the advisory related to that. As I said, we have a number of webinars and we produce a number of other pieces of really valuable content for organizations in the license management space, and we do a number of advisory projects in there. I'm not going to cover this right-hand side during the course of this webinar, but please look out for our webinar series specifically on SAMQ, on license management, on digital access, things like S/4HANA contract migrations, which we run both with in terms of VOQUZ Labs and with our partners. So please have a look for those. But let's just talk a little bit about the integration between our SAMQ and SETQ solutions. Why is it so important and what is unique about it? Well, first of all, we're probably the only organization that has both a GRC solution and authorizations and identity management solutions, as well as a license management solution. And therefore, from an authorizations and compliance perspective, we cover both sides. And why is this important? Because if you take a business case where you have business end users using your SAP solution and they are getting new roles, we're talking about role management, the impact of changing roles, updating roles, amending roles has a direct impact on their licenses. So if you don't have this connection, if this bridge is not there, you're not able to, in effect, manage both the authorization and compliance perspective in the GRC side of things, as well as the license management. And that's what's really unique about our offering to the market, is that we've tied these 2 solutions together so that when you have a new role assigned to an individual, that it automatically flags you related to the license change that may occur in your organization, making sure that you maintain your compliance at the right level. And on top of that, just to give you some context around SETQ, it really does all of your authorization and role concept design management. We try to make it as simple and user-friendly as possible, covering all the areas of compliance, work-based approvals, password management, etc. And we'll touch very shortly on a few of these elements because we're talking about roles. We also have an advisory, as I said earlier, and so we think about things like authorization concept redesign, where you may want to start from scratch. That's one of the things we'll look at today in terms of our role design. Compliance reporting and compliance checks to make sure that your compliance elements are all in place from authorization and audit perspective. And then you look at access security and S/4HANA role migration. So these are some of the key areas that we focus on from an organizational perspective. Right, let's jump on into our challenge with roles and just describing a bit of what is the current situation with SAP roles. As a project manager, a program manager, have been involved in many implementations of SAP. And so what I often find is at clients, we start off, especially if you're doing a greenfields implementation, you create this lovely new clean slate set of roles, and it gets tested and you go live and everything is fine and everything is working really well. But that happened 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even longer back. We've got some clients that already had SAP from 1999, almost R2 days. And suddenly over time, you know, the business has changed. You've added new applications. Your role structure has significantly now grown. Not only have the number of roles grown because you've taken on new solutions from SAP, etc. over time, but the context within those roles has now even grown even more. So the number of transactions within a composite role or even within a single role, the level of variance within that, in other words, the change, delete, amend type variance and the org units have also changed. I think of it from an architecture perspective. If we look at the overall architecture, which in SAP was built, things like your plant, your distribution centers, your logistics, all of those pieces, if you're in a logistics environment, those can all change and grow and shrink. You may have some acquisitions in your organization and create a whole new separate line of business that requires organizations to be set up. And this then affects the roles. So over time, you end up in a position where historically your roles have become very overgrown. And this is a common occurrence that we find in most organizations. Andreas, do you want to add any comments that you see about this, some experience from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Rogan, and thank you for having me today. Of course, I think you mentioned when people starting with SAP or started with SAP 20 years ago, and they have big roles because they have a lot of SAP all inside to cover all the needs that people can run the tests and everything. And sometimes these big roles will stay and will grow over the years. So people call them monster roles or dinosaur roles, stuff like that. And I think it's a pretty good challenge for everybody to work with this, to find out what could be the best and easiest way to work on these roads to become more up to date and more secure. And in our next webinars we will have an outlook to compliance and stuff like that. I had a good question yesterday evening from a customer. I cannot see questions here, but probably they will come up. So what is the best time to work on your roles when you go, for instance, to S/4HANA? And should I wait for S/4HANA or should I do it before? And I think the best answer is here, do it as soon as possible, because when you have a new project then with S/4HANA, then you don't want to think about roles. Then you have to think about integrating your system and everything. And therefore, we should think about starting early with ECC and take a look at for instance, for the 15,000 roads, shrink them or make new ones and try to make them best possible, like compliance issues and everything around that. But I think you will mention that later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, 100% what you said, Andreas. I mean, one of the biggest challenge that organizations face, we ran a similar or the same webinar last night for the US and Australia and New Zealand areas, and it was interesting to see. We're going to run some polls now, but lots of organizations, almost 50% of the people who were on the session last night said they're really trying to do a manual cleanup process. And this is really time consuming. Why? You've got to go into every single process, identify every single almost user in that role that they're using, then start cleaning up. This is not an easy, simplified process. And what we see in most organizations is that they want to clean up their roles. They go ahead and they start maybe with a specific department, and they clean up maybe 1,000 roles. And that's where it ends. And then they suddenly think, well, okay, we've now got to a good outcome. But this is not really where you might need to get to. And that's why we say our proposed approach is really to use a solution optimized role approach. You may think that you only need to get to 14,000, but wow, if you got to 8,000 roles and they were maintained and they stayed clean and were optimized, that would make a huge difference to your organizational efficiency. Okay, and that's really the drive that we have in terms of what we're sharing with today. So let's go to look at some of the drivers behind why would you need to optimize your roles. So, I mean, these are three key factors that we focus on. One is cost savings. Why? Because less is more. Less management on roles means less time, less effort, less input that you need to continuously update your roles and make sure that they're in place if you have less of them. Okay, it's far easier for your authorizations team to maintain and measure and manage 8,000 roles versus 15,000. I mean, you can think of all the mass changes that need to happen. So there's a certain cost savings potential that can be applied to that. Not only is it cost savings in terms of maintenance, it's also cost savings in terms of what we look at from an audit perspective. So every year we see, and we'll look at these during some of the webinars that we have in future around audits and how the increase in price of audits is going up year by year. Why? Because the auditors now need to challenge and check the compliance and the segregation of duty risks, etc., across 15,000 roles versus 8,000. That's a significantly big difference. So can we shrink that and help your internal audit, your external audit, manage a better set of roles from a cost savings perspective? That would make a huge difference for most organizations. On top of that, we then have the audit risk. You know, if you take 15,000 roles versus 8,000 in context, and you apply all the audit criteria, the rule set has to be far bigger, has to be far more comprehensive, has to be far more, you know, expanded for 15,000 roles. And now you have far more audit risk at play, because now you pull an online or an offline audit, and suddenly you have significantly more audit risks to deal with. With a larger set of roles that are, you know, overgrown, etc. And as Andreas said, you know, S/4HANA migration, when to start? It may be that you're in the process of getting your transformation journey on track, and you say, oh, you know, should I go in with a cleaner set of roles? Our views, of course, is absolutely don't start your roles in an S4 specific space with a whole lot of, let's call it, dirty roles. Why would you want to take dirty information into your latest system? It's the same with data. Whenever I've done programs and projects, we always recommend to customers, take a clean slate approach. Get your roles and the data and the elements that you have from an organizational perspective as clean as possible. So these are some of the drivers that we have. Andreas, any comments in this? While what we're going to do now, while Andreas has some comments, I'm going to launch a poll. It'd be great to hear what you have to say. Let's see what people have to say regarding this poll. I'm going to launch it now. So how do you clean your current set of roles? You should be able to answer that poll at the moment, and we have some votes coming in, and then yeah, we can talk about the poll. But any comments from your side, Andreas?
Not at the moment. Okay. I think you covered everything.
Great. Okay, let's see. The poll is coming in. Okay, and it's really quite interesting to see what's happening in terms of how people are managing their role cleanup. Okay, we're at over 60%, which is great. We want to thank you for everybody who's putting their time and effort into providing some information back. It's good that we get feedback from everybody in terms of the webinar. It makes it a bit more interactive for us. We'll leave it for another 20 seconds. We're almost at 75%, and I think when we hit the 75, close to 80%, then we'll close out the poll. And we'll share the poll with you shortly. Let's have a look now. Okay, let me share the poll results with everybody. So, interestingly, 70% are still using a manual process. And I'm sure if I spoke to you individually, you would say this is very time consuming and probably pretty expensive for your organization. 12% are using a tool set, and 18% have said we have not yet cleaned our role set. I think what would be interesting there to find out specifically is how long have you been on SAP? Is it something that you may have just been in a process of implementing SAP over the last, you know, maybe 2-3 years? Probably most people have been on SAP for quite a lot longer. For most organizations that we deal with, it's somewhere between 5, 10, and 15 years. And so definitely a manual process is being used on an ongoing basis. Andreas, any comments on that you want to fire away? And then we're going to run one more poll and then carry on with the presentation.
No, make the next one, please.
Okay, great. Let me hide this quickly and let's start our next poll. So in this case, we spoke about what would be a primary driver. We're speaking about drivers for role optimization. So let's talk about what do you see as the most important elements for you, and where is the pressure coming from? If you're from a management perspective, what is driving the fact that you need to cleanse and optimize your roles? This is interesting, Andreas. The votes are coming in, and we had a very similar set of answers in terms of the poll from
Okay.
our US team and from the
So
people from Australia.
this one is multiple choice, Rogan, right?
It
You
is
can
multiple choice.
you can answer
Definitely,
more than one. Yes. Okay.
you can have more than one, but what's interesting is just the outcome of it. So a combination of elements in this case.
Okay.
All right, and already we've got 70% of the vote in. Let's wait for another 5 or 15 seconds. Let's see if we can get that up to 75%. We're almost there, and then we'll have a quick look at the poll results and share that with you. And we're almost at that level. Okay, great. Let's close this poll out and let's share the results. So from a multiple choice perspective, you could have chosen any one of the three. What's interesting here is you can see that the audit risk is by far the biggest in this context. So really a pressure from internal audits and managing of the audit risk elements as compared to savings next at 44%, and the migration challenges from a transformation perspective are sitting at 32. There's also about 10% that say other. I would love to know what those other are. We've left it out there, and maybe you can put some comments in the question box around what you think is other. But yeah, Andreas, any comments from your side around the drivers from that are putting pressure on people to change their roles?
The audit risk is that what we learned over the last years, that it's more and more coming up. Auditors coming in, checking more detailed what's going on inside the roles, and so the pressure is definitely most out of audit risks here. And of course, everybody wants to achieve savings, but the drivers audit risk, I think, mostly.
Okay, great. Thank you for everyone who filled in the poll. Right, what do we see as two possible pathways to role optimization, and why have we put these down? Well, I said earlier we have a wide-ranging approach and a fast approach, and they are different, and they're really different for two reasons. One, because customers, as we've seen and have worked with, and I've been involved, as I said, with many different implementation processes and transformation journeys, they're at different spaces at different times, and they have different drivers at different times of their transformation journey. So it's never ever a one-fits-all approach to this. So we have the two approaches. They are definitely different in outcome. They're different in time. They're different in definition and phases. And they're also different in the amount of time and investment that you have to put into them, because one is a 4 to 6 month process and one is potentially a 4 to 6 week process. So we'll go through both of these and share with you what we see as how both of these can work for you in your organization based on your specific requirements. Let's have a look at the wide-ranging approach at the moment and take that on first. So what are the drivers for the wide-ranging approach? We've just put some key things down that we've seen from a business perspective. The first is, your lines of business and your business departments really want to have a greater amount of control over their existing authorizations and access processes. In the past, it might have been run by the IT department or the service department. Create your SU53, send it to IT, they update the role, and nowhere does it go to a business person who actually understands the process and therefore wants to actually manage the process more strictly, because at the end of the day, they get the audit risk. So within your department, if you are the financial manager, as an example, and suddenly you start getting IT assigning roles and authorizations to your team, and these aren't quite correct, you're going to pick up the flack on the audit risk. So definitely where we see this as a driver is from the fact that the departments really want to control their access and authorization processes. This means they want to minimize the amount of roles, and therefore they want to be in control of how many roles they actually work through. The existing process time is too time consuming. So in other words, to process and manage roles and to create new roles and expand them or even reduce them is such a time consuming process. We need to change the current processes. And so this may be a big driver. You're using manual. Most companies, as we saw earlier in this webinar, from a poll perspective, are saying, oh, we're using manual processes. That process is just too time consuming. Can we change it? All right, and there may be a business case for total authorization concept rebuild. In other words, you've had SAP maybe 10, 15 years. Your whole authorization concept might need to be changed. Why? Because at the moment you're sitting in a new SAP landscape, having taken on cloud solutions, different applications, you've got BI, you're suddenly trying to run your authorization concept from multiple different perspectives, and really it's a very disparate authorization concept. And you may also be moving to S4HANA. You think, oh, this is the right time. Let me restructure my entire authorization concept. Let me put a new one in place, rebuild it from scratch, from bottom up, and that may be the driver behind taking on a wide-ranging approach. As I said, what is different? Well, it's much higher definition. There are way more phases, so we'll look at the phases that you have to go through in this process. It does mean a greater time investment, but the outcome is very different to the fast approach. The outcome in this case is you actually start, you have a total clean slate, and you build totally new roles. Okay, it's not where we're going to look at when the fast approach, where we actually just optimize the existing set of roles. So here you want to have a total new set of roles, and we go through, and we would need some of the solution from SETQ to do this. So SETQ has a number of different managers. We're not, in this webinar, we're not going to go through every single manager, but be aware that there are lots of different managers. If you want to find out more about the managers and what they do, please get in touch with us. We can take you through a demonstration of the solution itself. But in the context of what we would need to create a new set of roles from scratch, we only need a few managers, and we want to automate this process to make it go as quickly as possible, because the manual process is too time consuming. So we have the identity manager. We need that to specifically manage all the users and the identities. We have our role manager, specifically, which creates what we call the functions and the packages. The functions are really all the transaction sets and the variations inside those transaction sets, and the single and composite roles, we call them A and J roles, as well as our role reference manager. The role reference manager is a reference set of roles. So you don't have to start building roles without having a role reference. So it's really a set of templates that come pre-populated with over 1,000 already structured roles, and then you can just tweak them using the extension manager. So run a trace on the existing roles and update them accordingly. As I said, lots of other managers. We're not going to jump into all of those. What is the process to create these new roles? As I said earlier, this is quite a much more in-depth set of processes. It requires a detailed project kickoff. It requires an engagement with the business to generate the new roles. So we need to look at what functions are required, what are the customized elements that you need to put into those functions from a Z and Y transaction sets, all your custom developments. What is the criticality of the functions that we need to have in place for the rules? What is the segregation of duties, all the audit requirements from an authorization package perspective? And then also the package definition. Packages in our context define all the organizational units. So we need to know what transactions and what processes and what organizations, units people are working in order to define a set of specific roles. We look at the job definitions, external areas, again, the segregation of duty rules and the rule sets that you're applying, the responsibilities of the people now from a line of business and the departmental level who will need to manage the roles. And then we define the matrix, in other words, the function and the package. This creates a matrix structure which we use, which is easier to maintain mass changes of roles, etc. And then we also do the elements around your process definition, who is going to maintain the master user data, and who's going to maintain the authorization. We set up all these elements from a project perspective, the allocation of the authorization and the workflows. And then we go into some of the last phases here quickly, specifically around the basic reference model, the customer rules specifically that you have, and defining who the contact person is if we need to have changes in the process, etc. Training, what trainings need to take place, The test phase, of course, we have to test the roles. We want to make sure we have a new set of roles, so you want to test them. And at the same point in time, when we roll out, we want to withdraw all the old roles. So there is a detailed role procedure, etc. So many more phases, much more detailed, but as we said earlier, the outcome is that you have a totally new set of roles.
Rowan,
Yeah.
let me say one thing to the slide here. This is pretty much agile, so that means you can change it. It has to be phase by phase. It can be different. And one interesting thing I want to mention here is that comparing to the other model you want to present now, in this model, when you take the reference model, we have 1,000 template roles here. All the roles are conflict or SOD free. So when you take the templates, you are happy with it. Of course, when you change it, you have to check it afterwards. But this is the big comparison from the one of the big comparison. Of course, it's workflows and everything, but it's the we had 75%, I think, from the audits as a driver, and here we have complete audit-proof role template roles we can use for the project.
Yeah, absolutely, Andreas. Again, the whole approach that we're trying to do is try and make it as optimized and as quickly as possible. Not, starting from scratch makes a huge difference from a timeline perspective. Okay, and it depends on the business size, how many users you have, what your requirements are in terms of this, and we normally set
exactly,
it from a detailed perspective. Right, let's have a look at the fast approach. Okay, what are some of the key drivers for the fast approach? In this case, you want a quick win. You want to keep your costs down and you want to improve your efficiency really quickly. These are the key elements. It's almost like similar to a very, very agile approach. We call it our fast approach. We don't want to use necessarily the word agile, but in this case, it has less definition. It has some standardized phases, in fact, only 2. There's less time investment required because we're going to take your existing roles and we're going to optimize them. We're not going to rebuild them. We're not going to need an entire role reference manager. We really want to take the roles that you have and reduce them down to only the required roles that you need from a business perspective. And that's the fundamental. So a different approach altogether. And within this approach, we have some different options, and we're going to show you what those different options are shortly. Andreas, any comments that you want to make on this basis?
Yeah, I think the thing we need to understand here is that in the comparison to the bigger approach, the bigger approach is tailored to the specific needs. We can make integrations with IDMs, ticket systems, establish workflow, do many things. This one is pretty much focused on reducing or shrinking existing roles. So I don't care about workflows or versionings or audits and everything. It's pretty much, hey, my roles are too big, or I have too many role assignments to users, and I want to shrink them to a reasonable size of a role. But in the core, it's still the old role.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. So let's just have a look at the phases and what within SetQ, because again, we spoke about we want to move away from a manual process or as much of a manual process as possible. So within the SetQ solution, we only need 3 of the managers. We need your identity manager if we're going to make some changes to the users. We are going to need the role manager, and of course, in this case, we're going to need the reduction manager. We're not going to need anything else, which is really key. So we do have a set of a tool set, which speaks to that earlier poll where people are saying, I'm doing this all manually. We have an opportunity here that you can use a tool set to do this. The reduction manager is really unique in the SetQ tool set. There aren't many other tool sets out there in the marketplace that can actually reduce the amount of roles and the role context that you have. What are the phases that we have? Very much simpler phases. So just, a very short project preparation, look at the project goals of what you want to achieve. We would need to do the role optimization as phase 2. Export your roles from SAP, run a trace on them to understand what you actually require in terms of what are the end users actually performing. And then we run through what we call the reduction side, the role optimization. We need you to review it from a business perspective. Of course, we cannot just go and say, oh, here your roles are, but they hadn't had any review from the business or approval. We can build into this process some consideration of the audit requirements, and we'll show you one of the options that allows for that. And again, from an options perspective, we both have a manual and an automated process of uploading these roles now back into SAP. So, we've tried to cater for various different business scenarios, and that's the whole point of taking a fast approach. So let's look at option one. You're sitting in a situation with overgrown users and overgrown roles. We run a trace through your SAP system, and we export these roles into our reduction manager. This reduction manager doesn't sit on site, so it's not something that you have to implement. It sits in a Docker Linux container in which we can run the reduction manager. So this is a little technical piece of functionality that allows us to run our software outside of your SAP solution. And once we've done the reduction of your roles, then we have two processes. We can either manually upload these after they've been checked by the business, and then you end up in a position with lean roles and lean users. This is option one. Andreas, any comments on this option first?
Yeah, maybe on the Docker containers. So everything from Secu is running on standard SAP ABAP software. But as we're working on the artificial intelligence, I think we will have a webinar later on for this team. So we worked on artificial intelligence, and that was a spin-off, which was the new reduction manager. The old one was also running on ABAP, but the new one needs to run on a much faster platform, and so we decided to go, especially here on reduction manager, to go to this Linux Docker containers, which is pretty easy to install, but it's much faster. And there's a lot of calculations need to be done to find out how to shrink roads to the lowest level. And yeah, that's the reason why we use it. And the manual process is, of course, let's say you want to shrink your overgrown roles, the row themselves, then you can make the reduction manager as the leading tool there, and then you say, okay, afterwards we want to go to PFCG to do the job. Then you need to export it somehow. Then you have to do it manual, and therefore we have the big arrows here, because the manual process is much bigger than you will see in the next slides when we use role managers and stuff like that.
Great, thank you, Andreas. As Andreas said, yeah, we can do this manually, but we prefer, if we have an option, we always want to automate the process. And for this, we can add in our role manager from SetQ perspective. This makes the process automated, and we can make sure that your roles, once they've been cleaned up and optimized, then can be automatically processed back into SAP. A whole lot of a simpler approach, and as you can see from an effort and time perspective, much easier, because we're shrinking that arrow and you come out with some lean roles. I'm going to go to the next slide. That's option 2. Option 3 really is where we do the same process, but we also add the identity manager in, and then we can also shrink and manage the users and upload those and through an automated process. So, your optimal approach would be to use all 3 of the managers from the SetQ solution, and it's only 3 that you need. And in this case, you then run a total automated approach to cleaning up your overgrown roles, the existing set. You get it back, but it's still the existing set of roles, but much leaner, and a much leaner set of users as well. Andreas, before we go to the last option, any comments that you want to add in there?
No, thanks.
Okay. And then the last option really is if you want to ensure that from a compliance perspective, your existing set of roles have all the relevant SOD compliance checks, and you want to run a offline audit, we can do that through the compliance manager. So we can rerun the roles that you now have and do a detailed compliance check and pull out and see, do you have very high risk? Do you have any critical risks? Do we have any challenges that have come through from your existing role set? So, you can now pick and choose which process you want to run, and in fact go through some different options, even in the fast approach that we have to role optimization, and say, at this point in time, I really want to just do the role manager and the reduction manager, or I want to do both. So again, we're providing a level of flexibility and a process, a tailor-made process for you as an organization to do role optimization using a tool set, not sticking on manual. We've seen how much manual time and effort it takes, especially if you have these monster roles, as Andreas said, and we want to make it as simple and easy for organizations to improve their efficiency in a very cost-effective manner. Right, before we jump into questions, what I would like to do is run another 2 sets of polls. I'm going to just go to the questions slide. So if you do have some questions, please type them in the questions box along while we are running the polls. What we want to find out is where are you at in terms of your roles? Do they require attention? How urgent is this? Are you looking at it within the next 6 to 12 months? Are they all okay? Do you feel that you're comfortable with your roles? Let's have a look at what the majority of our attendees say in terms of where they're at with their roles. Okay, we're going to give it some time. We're over 50% of the vote already. Let's wait for a few more individuals to give their feedback. It's great to see what people have to say about their roles and get a bit of context. Okay, and I also see I see a number of questions coming through. That's fantastic. We will, and we definitely have some time available for questions. I've tried to make sure that our webinar does leave enough time for questions, and we'll definitely get to those. So we will certainly come to all your questions. Thank you for everybody who's put questions in thus far. Okay, we're almost at 70% of the vote on this poll. I'm going to give it another 10 seconds and then we'll close it out. Let's see if there's any more. Okay, we've hit the 70%. Fantastic. Thank you everybody for putting your information into the poll. Let's close the poll. We've got another 1 or 2 people just inputting their information. Okay, let's close the poll. It's almost been 2 minutes, so we'll close this and then share it. So what does the poll reveal? So we have 17% of people on board saying they urgently need some change in their roles. I'm not sure how this came about. Is it just because it's been overgrown for a number of years and you realize, shucks, if we don't do something now, it's going to continuously cost us money? That could be the driver behind this. Most people are saying within 6 to 12 months, and significant rest, 30% almost, are saying they're okay at the moment. So for those of you who've said you urgently need some help, potentially, please reach out to us. We'd be very interested to engage with you and understand the challenges that you have and how we can find solutions to make that an easier place to manage in that context.
Rogan, let me say one thing to the last point. They are okay. This is one good point to mention, I think, because when they are okay, this can be, because they already did something on the roles, or they have already established a pretty cool workflow to that everything keeps clean and everything. But if not, so the roles are okay. We can use the existing roles also in the bigger model, the model number 1, to work with them. We can then make the audit runs, audit simulations, everything to keep them alive and keep them okay. So it's not always creating new ones. It's also keeping the old ones good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maintaining your roles on an ongoing basis and the compliance around those, most people said audit risk is a very high driver. So if you need to maintain them and want to do audit checks and help us or involve us to help you with that, please let us know. Right, we're going to launch our last poll before we jump into the questions. And this is really around the fact that we have many different webinars coming up, and we want to make sure that we answer some of the questions that organizations and you working in those organizations have. So tell us what you think is the most important elements for the upcoming webinars. It would be great to hear your feedback. We have set some webinars out, but definitely we look forward to getting feedback from our participants on these webinars as to what is most important to them and most interesting to them at this point in time. And we know that this changes. So during the year, the people, their role, their viewpoints change, perspectives change, but let's hear what people are saying at the moment. Okay, we're way over 50%. Great. Thank you for those already who filled in this. It's always good to get feedback on our webinars so that we can tailor that which we provide in terms of information to what you're really looking for. And that's really important for us. There's a multiple choice, so you can select all three. What's interesting is that the user management and compliance is neck and neck at 66% of the vote. Future outlooks is a little bit less. Okay, let's give it another 10 seconds and see if we get over the 70% from the vote perspective. Okay, there we go. Let's close out the poll with 70%. In this case, I will share that. So yeah, amazingly, user management and compliance neck and neck, 75% each, and future outlooks on new technologies, things like the authorizations and compliance for new SAP technologies, Fiori, S4HANA, cloud-based solutions. We'll certainly be taking that up in the future. We have, I think, a webinar in this is our third part 3 series of this webinar is going to look at future technologies. Our next webinar is certainly going to take into consideration user management. And certainly we have some webinars that we're going to be planning around compliance and the challenges that organizations have in compliance and how do we best mitigate those challenges. Andreas, any comments for you on the outcomes of these polls?
No, it's interesting. I thought it would be the future outlook to new technologies because I mentioned the artificial intelligence. No, just kidding. I think future technology is always interesting, but as I see here, I think we have people with issues in user management, and therefore, of course, it's more interesting than new technologies. The same for compliance.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for everyone who's filled out the poll. Let's go to some of the questions. What I want to do is try and answer as many of the questions as possible. If we don't get to the questions, what we will do at the end of the session, we have about 13 minutes left. What we will do is try and fill out and put the questions in an Excel spreadsheet and send it to everybody so that you have answers to that. But let's jump into the questions at the moment. So, okay, the first question that we have there that I'm going to answer or have a look at is, can you quantify the cost savings in US dollars or euros in terms of the role optimization? I'm sure we can. You say no, Andreas?
I would say, Rogan, no, it's completely dependent on the actual customer situation. How do the roles look like? Which model they take? Yeah, so the cost savings, yeah, you have to calculate for each customer a specific saving. Sometimes you can't, to be honest, because you cannot calculate from numbers you don't have. And sometimes it's possible because they have issues. For instance, we had a customer with an, let's say, the roads were a little bit old, and so they had a problem with an employee, and there was a SOD conflict, and he took some money. And of course, when he took some money, then you have a real good amount to calculate in return on investment. But if not, it's always hard to have a clear euro or dollar number here.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. What is the cost difference between wide and fast-ranging approach? Yeah, of course, there's a cost difference. One takes 4 to 6 months, and we do that based on the client-specific requirements and how many roles they have to cleanse, etc. It is very client-specific. The fast-range approach as well. we would need to sit down from an individual client by client basis and understand what it is that they want to do, detail some of those requirements in a little bit more detail. We do have some questionnaires that we can send organizations and companies that help us to define that in more detail, especially for the wide-ranging approach. But if you, as I said right throughout the presentation, if you want to understand more about how we go about this, please reach out to us. Our details are available on our webpage, and you can get in touch with us, and we can certainly have a separate session to discuss which is the best option for you and your organization. Okay, a question quickly: how does identity management tie up with SAP postponers? Maybe not so specific to this topic. Andreas, do you want to answer that?
Of course, this belongs more to the, no, it's not, because many companies use any kind of identity management systems. It must not be SAP, IDM, they are different on in the market. And of course, we work with those identity managements together. They become the leading system then, and then you can assign the roles via IDM systems, and you prepare the roads in the first or second way. It's still roads on the lowest level. It will be PFCG roads, and so it will be easy. And no matter which one of those approaches you decide for, it will work with IDM.
Okay, we have some questions in terms of since we have lines of business, are the roles defined already in SAD fashions with new S4HANA? And would we need to optimize those? So, Andreas, do you want to try and take that?
Yes, of course, we are completely SOD familiar with all the, not all, but we have a lot of SOD conflicts in our reference model. The whole SETQ solution is S4 ready. But if you want to change something, let's say you have a special industrial solution from SAP, or you have a special need from an auditor, or you're in a special environment or so, then you can change those templates or integrate your own. So you have your own rule set you want to integrate, and everything is possible. And if you say, okay, we want to take the one from SETQ, you can order the compliance reference manager, and we have around about, I think, 500 audit conflicts inside, and also the SOD conflicts are covered here.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Okay, this also covers S4HANA on the cloud, so I'm not going to go into that in more detail. We've already mentioned S4HANA. An example of role reduction or reducing a role. I mean, quite simply, you may have, just let me give a quick example of that. You may have somebody in the finance team who over time has gained additional transactions in the procurement space or in MM, etc., and they no longer lead those transactions. So in essence, you would reduce the role down with a number of transaction sets. It could be that you reduce them in the context that they don't need create access anymore, they only need display access. It all depends on what's happening within the business and how the business is changing. So that's why it's really important from an engagement perspective to understand what the business process is, and therefore against that you restructure the role. The role and the business process from an architecture perspective are always tied together to people's jobs and the individuals that perform those business processes. So if you have a change in business process, you should restructure your role against the business process. That's why when I do enterprise architecture in many organizations in the past, I always focus on making sure that the business process is as up to date as possible, because that will mean that your role is up to date as possible. Okay. Quick question then, I hope that answers that question in terms of an example. I mean, there are many examples of why you would want to reduce roles, and we're not going to go into all of them. Why would you manually enter the role, optimized roles? Well, sometimes we have very small customers, customers who may not have, 10, 15, 20,000 roles. They may only have a small number of users. We deal with customers who only have, for example, 200 users. So in their case, it may not be that, from a cost perspective, you want to just clean them up using the reduction manager and enter them manually. It might be a quicker process for you. For most bigger organizations, of course, to run a optimized process is going to be a much better way of doing it. Which is cheaper, manual or automated? It depends. Depends on the customer size, the number of roles. There are too many moving parts in this context to say this is cheaper, manual or automated. depends on what the volume is. In most cases, just from a context of speed, so time, it's going to be way quicker to do it in an automated approach. So think about it from the context of that and say, okay, maybe it makes sense to go the automated role. Yeah, yes, just a comment here. It seems that 75% for audit seems to me the option 4 should be taken. Yeah, we can certainly provide you with a cost estimation for this option. Definitely for where you take in the fast approach, where you want to make sure that all your audit processes are covered from a perspective there. Okay, there's another question around compliance manager, caters for which geographical area. I think, you know, we cover the globe in terms of SETQ, so I don't want to go into detail about which areas geographically it caters for.
Maybe I understand the question a little bit different. So when let's say you run an audit for South Africa, for Germany, and for China, for instance, then the conflicts can be different. So let's say SAD in South Africa is not so critical, but in China it is critical because of special reasons. And then you can differentiate those conflicts out of your org units, and you can say, okay, we have a package here for China, and we have a different set of roles, or we have a different way to handle it. Both is possible.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. We have a question here about the logic. What is the logic behind the reduction manager? Andreas, do you want to share a little bit about the technical logic behind that?
This is development stuff, to be honest, but I created a small example. Rogan, I will send it to you, and maybe you can send it to the attendees, how it will calculate the way to or how it will shrink roads, for instance.
Okay, fantastic. We'll send that to you afterwards. As I say, there's some specific development that has been taking place in the reduction manager, and as I say, and as Andreas said, from a technical perspective, we're actually going to be releasing one that has artificial intelligence as well, that is really cutting edge, and we can share that information with you. Okay, how can we replace the function of identity manager? I assume this is in the context that you have SAP Identity Manager. So yeah, certainly SETQ can replace the Identity Manager function. We have the Identity Manager in SETQ is what it is, and we can certainly share that with you. It depends on what Identity Manager you may be running. So I think you need to maybe just give us a bit more information in the context of that question around that. All right, to what compliance standard best practice have we adopted in Compliance Manager? Andreas, do you want to give some context around what the best practice or the standard is? As far as I understand, we have got the SAP user groups.
Yeah, exactly. So it is a 20 years. Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, it is a more than a 20 years experience over around about 300 customers, and of course the input of many customers from projects. But as you told already, it is the DSAG, the German user group of SAP. The German word is Prüfungsleitfaden. So it's the rule set of the German user group mostly, and then we have best practice approaches from the customers, from the auditors, and everything inside.
Okay, and just to add to that, of course, for many organizations that we work with, we've done over 200 implementations. So we've developed additional best practices, and of course you can adjust or customize your rule sets. That doesn't mean you have to stick to only that, but this is the standard rule set that it comes with. That's been developed since from 20 years ago. So definitely we can use that. Can the tools be used on S4HANA and ABAP systems? Absolutely. That normally ABAP, they're an add-on. From an architecture perspective, it sits alongside your solution manager, has an integration through the Solman system, and the SETQ solution sits in that context. The web manager sits next to that, and you can have an easy-to-use GUI interface. Is role reduction always tied with cost savings? Yes, most likely it is. In most cases, it is tied with cost savings. Why? Because it creates improvements in efficiency. And when you create improvements in efficiency, you normally get cost savings.
Yeah, so it's process, it's compliance, and the result is cost savings.
Yeah, absolutely. Can the tools be used for Fiori app roles? Yes, we do use the SetQ tools for Fiori app roles. If you want, we can share some information around that specifically. Please reach out to us for Fiori and app roles. And then there's a few other questions here. I know we're right on the hour, so I want to close this out. We will be sending the presentation. Yes, we do have customers who are using this role reduction methodology. That covers our questions. I'm just going to close out that as the questions. Just to give you a quick information, we have 2 upcoming webinars just before we close out today's session. One is around your SAP license management measurements or an unfriendly audit. Please look out for this. It's coming up in the beginning week of April, 6th and the 7th. Check out your time zone. We run these both for the US and for the European time zones and Australia as well. And then our next webinar from a GRC perspective will be around optimizing our user management and user management fundamentals for SAP environments. This is part 2. This is coming out late April. We look forward to seeing you in our webinars. And from my side and from Andreas' side, thank you very much. We're going to close out the webinar now.
Thank you, Rogan. Bye.
Bye-bye.